Jane Birkin was born in London, became Paris's most beloved foreigner, put her name on the most coveted handbag in fashion history, and raised three daughters, each extraordinary in her own right. And then she buried one of them. By the time she died in July 2023, found alone in her Paris home at 76, the world had lost more than an actress or a singer. There was a cost to all of that living, and it came in ways she never expected. This is the story of how she got there. The girl from Chelsea. Jane Mallory Birkin was born on December 14, 1946, in Marylebone, London. She grew up in Chelsea, in a household that was, by any measure, unusual. Her father, David Leslie Birkin, was a Royal Navy lieutenant commander who had spent the Second World War working in intelligence, running clandestine operations in support of the French resistance. He was not a man who talked much about what he had done, in the way that men of that generation rarely did. But the shape of his life, the quiet courage of it, the way he had committed himself to something larger than his own comfort, left a mark on his daughter that showed up later in ways she may not have even recognized as his influence. Her mother, Judy Campbell, was an actress and one of the most celebrated stage performers of her generation. She was Noel Coward's muse, the woman for whom he wrote one of his most famous songs. She was glamorous, talented, and very present in the artistic life of mid-century London. Growing up with her as a mother meant growing up surrounded by the world of performance, of beauty, of creative ambition. Jane had a brother, Andrew, who would later become a well-regarded screenwriter and director. The family was close, cultured, and comfortable. They moved in circles where artists, actors, and intellectuals were simply the ordinary company of daily life. Her father's wartime connections gave the household a certain gravity, a sense that there were things in the world worth risking everything for. Her mother's world of theatre added beauty and performance, and the particular electricity of people who live for an audience. By Jane's own account, her childhood was close to magical. She described it as divine, and said that nothing in adult life quite touched the joy of those early years. It was the kind of childhood that leaves a specific and lasting impression, not because it was perfect, but because it was vivid, the kind of beginning that makes the rest of life feel like it has to measure up. But underneath the golden surface, something more fragile was already present. She described herself as a shy child, not timid exactly, but uncertain in the particular way of someone who has been told, in a dozen small ways, that the body she inhabits is not quite right. At boarding school on the Isle of Wight, she was bullied persistently for her looks, told she was too thin, too angular, too boyish, not feminine enough in the ways that other girls seemed to be. She talked later in life about how much that had wounded her, how it had planted a certain insecurity that took years to stop feeding, and how she had grown up genuinely unsure whether the camera would like her or not. She once asked her second cousin, the film director Carol Reed, for advice about pursuing acting. Reed told her that everything depended on whether the camera loved her. He couldn't promise her that it did. She took the chance anyway. She also admitted, decades later, that she had started taking sleeping pills at the age of 16 and never fully stopped, a quiet dependency that ran the full length of her life, mostly invisible, but there. That is not a small detail. It speaks to something about the gap between the person other people saw and the experience of actually being her, night after night, in the quiet that fame doesn't fill. But at 16, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a girl who had grown up watching her mother make the theatre feel like the most important room in any city, and who had quietly decided she wanted to be in that room too. She would get there, faster than almost anyone could have predicted. And the way she got there would change her life in ways that were not entirely her own choosing. The swinging 60s and the first mistake. In 1965, when Jane was 18 years old, she landed a role in a stage musical called Passion Flower Hotel. The music for the production had been composed by a man named John Barry, the same John Barry who had already made his name writing the scores for James Bond films. He was charming, successful, and considerably older than the girl he found himself falling for. Her father initially refused to let them marry. Jane was too young, and the age gap was too wide. But when she turned 18, the wedding went ahead. In 1967, their daughter Kate was born. It was not a happy marriage. Jane described it later as genuinely miserable. Barry was unfaithful. He became involved with a friend of Jane's, and the betrayal was not something she could move past. The wound was not just romantic. It was the particular devastation of discovering that the person you trusted most had made you the last to know. By 1968, the marriage was over. Barry left for the United States, and Jane found herself alone in London at 21 years old, with a baby daughter, a failed marriage, and a career that had produced a few minor film roles, but nothing that had yet defined her. She had appeared in a brief, largely uncredited part in Michelangelo Antonioni's film Blow Up in 1966, a film that became one of the defining works of the swinging London moment, that specific cultural explosion of the mid-1960s when London briefly felt like the centre of the known world. She was in it, but only barely, a background figure in a scene that would become iconic. The film itself, its mood, its portrayal of glamour and emptiness, and the strange hollowness underneath the surface of beautiful people doing beautiful things, was, in retrospect, an oddly accurate reflection of where Jane herself was standing in those years. That sense of being present but not yet quite arriving, of hovering at the edge of something transformative, described her life perfectly in that period. She was beautiful, clearly talented, and moving in the right circles. But she was also adrift, heartbroken, carrying a child who reminded her every day of a life that had already broken apart before it really got started. She tried auditioning in Los Angeles as well as London. Nothing caught. She later said that her father's admiration for the French resistance, for the people he had worked with during the war, for what France had represented in its darkest hour, had always made France feel like a country worth choosing. When the offer came for Slogan, she didn't hesitate. Going to France felt, she said, like a decision made for her before she even knew she was making it. And then someone offered her a role in a French film. She didn't speak French. She had no real reason to go. But she went anyway, with Kate in her arms and not much else. That decision, made in something closer to desperation than ambition, would turn out to be the most consequential of her life. Paris and the man who changed everything. In 1968, Jane Birkin travelled to Paris to audition for the lead female role in a French film called Slogan, directed by Pierre Grimblat. She did not speak a single word of French. She sobbed through her screen test, apparently so visibly distressed that it moved the people in the room rather than putting them off. She got the part. Her co-star was a 40-year-old Frenchman named Serge Gainsbourg. Gainsbourg was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was dishevelled, gap-toothed, and famously ungroomed. He smoked constantly, drank heavily, and had a talent for provocation that had made him one of the most talked about and divisive figures in French music and culture. He was also one of the most genuinely gifted songwriters of his generation, capable of lyrics that were startlingly beautiful, emotionally complex, and occasionally so explicit they got his records banned across Europe. He was 18 years older than Jane. He was also, when she met him on set, deeply in love with someone else. specifically Brigitte Bardot, who had recently ended their relationship and left him flattened by it. Jane's first impression of him was not favourable. She told her brother Andrew that he was horrible, arrogant, dismissive, openly contemptuous of her. He barely acknowledged her presence. She cried about it privately and powered through professionally. Then there was a dinner, a cast gathering organised by the director, during which Gainsbourg, who never danced, allowed himself to be dragged onto the dance floor by Jane. He stepped on her toes. He was awkward and uncertain in a way that nothing else about him had suggested. And in that moment, something shifted. She understood that the arrogance was a wall, not a fact, that the man behind it was something else entirely. They ended up at a club afterward, dancing until the early hours. They went back to his hotel. She woke up the next morning with the feeling, she said later, that she had stumbled into one of the most romantic evenings of her life. By the time filming on Slogan was done, they were inseparable. Jane stayed in France. A film called La Piscine offered her another role before she could go back to London, and she took it. And then another role appeared, and then the music began. Paris held her in the way cities sometimes hold people who were never meant to stay, by providing them, almost immediately, with the thing they had been looking for, without knowing it. What followed was 12 years that neither of them could have designed. 12 years that would make them famous across Europe, produce one of the most iconic artistic partnerships of the 20th century, and ultimately cost Jane more than she had bargained for. The song that scandalized the world. In 1969, Serge Gainsbourg released a duet with Jane Birkin that immediately became one of the most controversial records ever made. Je t'aime, moi non plus, which translates roughly as I love you, nor do I, was a song Gainsbourg had originally recorded with Brigitte Bardot. Bardot had asked him to suppress it, unwilling to have it released publicly given its content. Gainsbourg obliged, and then, after Jane came into his life, he recorded it again with her. The song was breathy, intimate, and unmistakably sensual in a way that left very little to the imagination. It was banned by radio stations in the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, and Sweden. Vatican radio condemned it. The controversy was immediate and enormous. It was also, despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, a massive commercial hit. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom charts. It sold across Europe in numbers that neither of them had expected. The notoriety drove the attention, and the attention drove the sales. Gainsbourg later said that the Pope had been their greatest publicist. For Jane, the song was something more complicated than a hit record. She had not written it. She had not designed the persona that came with it. The breathless, slightly vulnerable young Englishwoman in the arms of an older, difficult, brilliant Frenchman. But that persona attached itself to her in a way that proved almost impossible to separate from everything else she was. For years, and in some corners forever, that image of her, doe-eyed, whispering in French, existing partly as the creation of someone else's artistic vision, was the first thing people reached for when they tried to describe her. She was more than that, and she knew it. But knowing it, and being seen clearly as it were for a while, two very different things. What she also knew was that she was genuinely in love with him, not with the image, not with the fame, but with the actual man she had found underneath the performance. The one who had stepped on her toes and been embarrassed about it. The one who wrote songs for her that were, in their best moments, extraordinarily tender. She would spend the next decade trying to hold on to that man, while the drinking steadily erased him. 12 years, and what they cost. The life that Jane and Serge built together in Paris was, by any external measure, extraordinary. They lived at 5B Rue de Verneuil in the 7th arrondissement, a townhouse that Gainsbourg filled with an increasingly dense collection of objects, artwork, and the accumulated evidence of a man who couldn't stop acquiring things. They went out most nights, dancing and drinking and moving through the circles of Parisian artistic life that revolved partly around them. They came home before school hours to wake their daughters, Kate, who was Jane's from her marriage to John Barry, and Charlotte, born in July 1971 as Gainsbourg's child, and see them off to school before going to bed as the city was waking up. It was a genuinely bohemian life, in the old sense of the word. Not curated or performed for anyone, but actually lived that way, with all the chaos and beauty and exhaustion that implies. And it produced real work. Jane made film after film throughout the 1970s, building a substantial career in French cinema largely on her own terms. She earned a César Award nomination for her performance in Gainsbourg's film Je t'aime moi non plus in 1976. She appeared in the Agatha Christie adaptations Death on the Nile in 1978 and Evil Under the Sun in 1982, finding audiences in the English-speaking world that her French films hadn't reached. She collaborated musically with Gainsbourg on albums that moved steadily further from the breathless pop of their early work into something more emotionally complex. Her English accent, which she never lost, and which had initially seemed like a limitation, became one of the most distinctive and beloved things about her. French audiences found it charming. Directors found it useful. She found eventually that it was simply part of who she was. An Englishwoman who had chosen France, permanently in between the two countries, entirely belonging to neither one and somehow to both. She was not just his muse. She was a working actress, and a serious one, building a body of work that was entirely her own, even when it existed in his shadow. But the shadow was growing in ways that had nothing to do with fame. Gainsbourg's drinking had been part of his personality from the beginning, a component of the romantic dissolution that was inseparable from his public image. In the early years it was, if not manageable, at least navigable. They had their spectacular public dramas, including a legendary evening at the Paris nightclub Castell's, when Jane, furious at Gainsbourg for going through her basket and exposing its contents, threw a custard tart in his face before chasing him down the boulevard. He retaliated. She jumped into the Seine to cool down, fully clothed in her Yves Saint Laurent top, resurfaced, and walked home arm in arm with him, both of them dripping and laughing. That kind of chaos was part of the texture of what they were: intense, combustible, occasionally absurd, and deeply tied to each other. As the decade wore on, the drinking became neither navigable nor navigable. He became controlling during recording sessions, screaming at her, sometimes striking her when she couldn't deliver a performance to his satisfaction. The man who had been tender on a dance floor in 1968 was increasingly replaced by someone dangerous in his unpredictability. The passion that had driven the relationship was still present, but it had curdled into something that left her feeling, as she described it, less like a partner and more like a puppet. Someone whose value was bound up entirely in what she could provide for him. By 1980, Jane had reached her limit. She was 33 years old. She had given 12 years of herself to this relationship, and she could see clearly that it was not going to get better. She left. What she did not do, and this was the thing that defined the rest of both their lives, was stop loving him. The relationship ended, but the connection didn't. Gainsbourg continued to write music for her after the separation. When Jane had her third daughter, Lou, in September 1982, with her new partner, the French film director Jacques Doyon, Gainsbourg sent a box of baby clothes along with a card calling himself Papa Deux. He became Lou's godfather. They remained until his death, something for which there is not quite a proper word. Not lovers, not merely friends, not quite family, but something that encompassed all of those and couldn't be reduced to any of them. After Surge, the 1980s and 1990s were, in many ways, the years in which Jane Birkin became most fully herself. She continued working as an actress, taking roles that were substantially more interesting than the ones she might have been offered had she stayed in England. She worked with directors like Jacques Rivette, Agnès Varda. In a particularly celebrated collaboration, Jane B. Parr, Agnès Fille, in 1988, and Merchant Ivory. She won the Victoire de la Musique Award for Female Artist of the Year in 1992. She worked on stage, playing a leading role in Euripides' The Trojan Women at the National Theatre in London in 1995. And in 1983, she walked into the Hermès story. The actual encounter happened on a flight from London to Paris, when Jean-Louis Dumas, the chairman of Hermès, found himself seated next to a woman whose overflowing diary and loose papers had spilled when she tried to stow her bag overhead. In the resulting conversation, she sketched out her idea for a perfect bag, something large enough to be practical, soft enough to be comfortable, elegant enough to carry anywhere. Dumas went away and created it. The Birkin bag was formally introduced in 1984. Black, supple leather, hand-stitched, with the casual permanence of something designed to last a lifetime. The bag became, in time, one of the most recognizable luxury objects in the world. A status symbol of a particular kind, not merely expensive, but deliberately difficult to acquire, sold through a process designed to test the patience and connections of the buyer rather than simply their wealth. The waiting lists were legendary. The resale prices were extraordinary. The name Birkin became shorthand for a specific stratum of aspiration that had very little to do with the woman who had inspired it. Jane herself was ambivalent about the whole thing for most of her later life. She found the association with extreme luxury uncomfortable. In 2015, she publicly asked Hermès to remove her name from the crocodile skin version of the bag, citing concerns about how the leather was sourced. Hermès addressed the issue and the relationship continued. But the gesture was entirely characteristic of her, a refusal to let her name stand for something she couldn't stand behind. Meanwhile, Serge Gainsbourg was drinking himself toward the end. His health had been deteriorating for years. He suffered his first heart attack in the early 1970s, survived it, and kept drinking. On March 2nd, 1991, he was found dead at his home on the Rue de Verneuil. He was 62 years old. The cause was a second, fatal heart attack. Jane had spoken with him on the phone the day before. She was 44 years old when she lost him, and what she lost was not merely an ex-partner. It was the person who had shaped the most important decade of her life, the person who had written her most meaningful songs, the person who had known her most fully at the moment when she was first becoming herself. She kept performing his music. She commissioned orchestral arrangements of his songs and toured them for years. She never quite let go of that part of her life, and she was clear about not wanting to. He had written things for her that remained the truest expression of who she was, she felt, and performing them was not clinging to the past. It was honoring something that was still present. But another loss was coming, one she could not have prepared for. Kate. Kate Barry was Jane's firstborn, the daughter she had with John Barry, the child she had carried to Paris in 1968, when everything was falling apart, and she had no clear idea what came next. Kate had grown up in extraordinary circumstances. Raised for her first years by Jane and Serge, in the bohemian chaos of the Rue de Verneuil house, surrounded by the most celebrated artistic figures in France, and yet also the child of a broken first marriage, largely estranged from her biological father until she was a teenager. It was the kind of childhood that produced complicated people, deeply sensitive, broadly experienced, uncertain of exactly where they belonged. She became a photographer, a good one. She had developed her eye early, using Gainsbourg's Polaroid camera as a child to capture the world around her, a world that happened to include some of the most interesting faces of late 20th century France. Her work appeared in British Vogue, the Sunday Times magazine, Paris Match, Le Figaro, and other major publications. She had a son, Roman, born in 1987. She had held exhibitions in Paris, including one shortly before her death entitled Point of View, Portraits, Still Life. By any measure, she had built a life and a real creative practice. But Kate had also struggled, for much of her adult life, with depression and with substance dependency, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself clearly from the outside, but hollows things out from within, slowly and persistently. She had founded an addiction treatment center outside Paris at some point in her adult years, drawing on her own experience. She was, in that sense, trying to turn something difficult into something useful for others. That instinct, to transform personal suffering into something that could help someone else, was familiar. It was something Jane had done too, in her own way, for her entire career. On the evening of December 11th, 2013, Kate Barry fell from the fourth-floor window of her apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. She was 46 years old. She was found on the pavement below. Her apartment was locked from the inside. Antidepressants were found in her home. The circumstances of her death were not definitively resolved publicly. Her half-sister, Charlotte Gainsbourg, later disputed reports of deliberate intent, and the full truth of what happened that evening remained something the family kept private. What was not in dispute was the outcome. Kate Barry was gone. Jane was 67 years old when she lost her eldest daughter. She had already buried Gainsbourg. She had already carried the accumulation of what 12 years with him had been. And now this. In 2020, she released an album called Oh, Pardon tu dormais. Oh, sorry, were you sleeping? The record was, in its entirety, a meditation on grief, on loss, on what it feels like when the people who were supposed to remain are suddenly absent. She had written the album in the years after Kate's death, and recording it had required her to go to a place most artists avoid entirely, the undefended, uncomposed centre of a sorrow that she had no interest in making palatable. It was one of the most praised works of her career, and it was entirely the product of the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The final years. In the years after Kate's death, Jane Birkin continued to perform, to record, to show up. In 2016, she appeared in a Swiss short film called La Femme et le Tigre, a quiet, lovely piece about an older woman who waves at a passing train every day and begins a correspondence with the train's driver. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Live Action Short Film. Jane said at the time that it would be her final film role. At 69, she was not retreating so much as choosing where to place her remaining attention. In 2021, her daughter Charlotte directed a documentary about their relationship, Jane by Charlotte, which had its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival in July of that year, with both women on the red carpet together. It was one of Jane's last public appearances, and it was a particularly meaningful one. A mother and daughter, on camera, working through something unspoken between them. Charlotte had always said that Jane had been difficult to reach emotionally, loving, but somehow elsewhere, present in body, but not always fully available. The documentary was an attempt to close some of that distance while there was still time. It was also, without anyone intending it to be, a farewell. In September 2021, Jane suffered a stroke. It was described as mild, and she survived it, but the effect on her body was significant. From that point on, her family maintained a nearly constant presence around her, caregivers and family members alternating to make sure she was never truly alone for long. By 2023, she had been living with leukemia for over 2 decades. She had been diagnosed in 2002 and had managed the illness with a characteristic combination of medical care and refusal to make too much of it publicly. The cancer had worsened in the spring of 2023, forcing her to cancel a series of planned concerts. She had written to her audience in May of that year, telling them she remained an optimist and that she simply needed more time before she could be with them again on stage. She was still planning to perform at the Olympia Concert Hall in Paris. She was still, in the way she had always been, oriented toward what came next, rather than toward what was ending. In mid-July 2023, after nearly 2 years of constant care, Jane expressed a wish to spend a night alone, just one night, by herself, in her Paris home. The caregivers who had been with her stepped back. She got the evening she had asked for. On the morning of July 16th, 2023, one of her caregivers arrived and found her at home. She had died during the night. She was 76 years old. Her family later confirmed that she had died of natural causes after 16 years of fighting illness. The official statement was precise and quiet, the way Jane herself had always been about the things that mattered most. France's President Emmanuel Macron described her, in the hours after the news broke, as someone who had embodied freedom, who had sung the most beautiful words in the French language, and who had been a French icon. All of this from a woman who had arrived in Paris in 1968, not speaking a single word of French, and who never quite lost her English accent, even after decades in the country she had chosen as her home. The French Ministry of Culture called her a timeless francophone icon. The French culture minister described her as mischief, impertinent elegance, and the never-outdated emblem of an entire era. They were right. And they were also, as tributes tend to be, not quite sufficient to the actual person. What she left behind. At Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, there is a grave that holds two people who should not, by any logic of timing, be in the same place. Jane Birkin's ashes were interred there after her funeral at the Church of Saint-Roch on July 24th, 2023. The grave already held her daughter Kate, who had been buried there a decade earlier. It is, by the standards of the places where famous people are laid to rest, a quiet and private corner of the cemetery. Not far away is the grave of Serge Gainsbourg, who had been buried at Montparnasse in 1991. Gainsbourg's grave, famously, is one of the most visited in all of Paris, perpetually decorated with metro tickets, cigarettes, flowers, and small offerings left by people who feel they owe him something. In death, as in life, the three of them were not far from each other. She is survived by her daughters Charlotte Gainsbourg and Lou Doyon, by her brother Andrew Birkin, by her sister Linda, and by 6 grandchildren. Charlotte has continued her career as one of the most respected actresses and recording artists in France, winning the Cannes Best Actress Award in 2009 and releasing music that has its own devoted following. Lou has similarly built a body of work across music, acting, and visual art. Both daughters carry her forward in ways that are unmistakably connected to who she was. The fearlessness, the refusal to stay inside safe creative boundaries, the willingness to make work about things that actually matter to them. The Birkin bag continues to be made. Hermès announced, after Jane's death, that it would honour her arrangement to donate a portion of every bag sold to charity. The bag she had sketched on the back of an airplane vomit bag in the early 1980s, the practical solution of a young mother who couldn't find what she needed, had become one of the most expensive objects in contemporary fashion, sometimes selling on the secondary market for more than the price of a house. The original prototype, which had belonged to Hermès, sold at Sotheby's in July 2025 for more than $10 million. The most practical bag in the world had become the most impractical symbol imaginable. She had said once, with a dry English humour that never quite left her regardless of how French she became, that she suspected the bag would end up being the headline of her obituary. She was not wrong, and she seemed to understand that such is the particular absurdity of fame. That the thing you didn't design for yourself ends up being the thing most people reach for first when they try to summarize you. But what she actually left behind is more complicated and more beautiful than a handbag. She left behind a body of work, more than 70 films, more than 20 albums, a range of collaborations that stretched from Michelangelo Antonioni in 1966 to her daughter Charlotte in 2021, that belonged entirely to her, not to Gainsbourg's vision of her, not to the fashion world's version of her, not to the image of the breathless young Englishwoman in a French film from 1968. To her, she left behind the evidence of a life lived with a particular kind of openness, to people, to places, to difficulty, to the specific grief of outliving people you love. She was not a private person in the way that many public figures eventually become. She talked about Kate, she talked about Gainsbourg. She made an album out of the worst years of her life and let people hear it. She allowed her daughter Charlotte to point a camera at her and ask the questions that had gone unasked for decades, and she answered them. She left behind those 3 daughters, each one a distinct person, each one living proof that something essential about Jane Birkin, the fearlessness, the creative drive, the willingness to be fully present even when that presence is painful, had been passed forward into the next generation. She also left behind her activism, the campaigns for human rights and against capital punishment, the work with Amnesty International, the advocacy for AIDS research and for migrant rights in France, the willingness to use her name and her platform for things that mattered even when doing so was professionally inconvenient. She was not content to be decorative. She never had been, despite the world's persistent attempts to describe her that way. The girl who had been bullied at boarding school for being too thin, too boyish, not enough of one thing or another. She had turned out to be exactly enough. More than enough. She had arrived in Paris in 1968 with an infant in her arms, no French, and very little certainty about what came next. She had made it her home, her country, and ultimately her resting place. She had loved well and been loved back, not always in equal measure and not always without cost, but genuinely, in the way that leaves something permanent in the world. She had never entirely left. And the particular warmth she brought to every room she walked into, that thing that is impossible to manufacture or describe precisely, but that everyone who encountered her seemed to feel, that doesn't quite leave either. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a photograph taken in 1930. A tall, lean man stands in a garden in Rochester, New York, well-dressed, composed, 76 years old. He has given away more money than most people will ever see. His name is on schools, hospitals, and concert halls. By every visible measure, a man who has won. 2 years later, he was gone. not from old age, but from a decision made quietly, alone, in his bedroom on a Tuesday morning in March. He left behind a note so brief and strange that people are still trying to understand it. George Eastman built Kodak into one of the most powerful companies on earth. He put a camera in the hands of ordinary people for the first time. He transformed the way human beings remember their lives. And then something inside him broke, or perhaps had always been broken, quietly, underneath everything. This is the story of how he got there, and what it cost him. The boy from nowhere. George Eastman was born on July 12, 1854, in Waterville, a small town in upstate New York. His father, George Washington Eastman, ran a business school in Rochester. His mother, Maria Kilbourne Eastman, was a steady and devoted woman who would turn out to be one of the most important forces in his life. He had two older sisters. The early years were ordinary enough: a modest household, a working father, the kind of childhood that doesn't announce itself as the beginning of anything remarkable. But when George was 5 years old, the family moved to Rochester so his father could expand the business school. And then, 3 years later, when George was just 8 years old, his father died. What followed was the kind of quiet, grinding hardship that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but shapes a person completely. His mother took in boarders to keep the family afloat. She cooked, cleaned, managed the house, and raised 3 children with very little money and no safety net. George watched all of this. He absorbed it. And somewhere in those years, a deep and almost obsessive drive took root in him. The drive to never be poor again. To never watch someone he loved struggle the way his mother struggled. He left school at 14. Not because he wanted to, but because the family needed income. He found work as a messenger boy, then as an office clerk for an insurance company, and the work was not glamorous or particularly interesting, but it was consistent. He showed up on time, learned quickly, made himself useful. He taught himself bookkeeping at night, studying alone after long days, and eventually landed a better-paying position at the Rochester Savings Bank. He was careful with money, disciplined. He tracked every penny with a meticulous attention that some people who worked alongside him found almost unsettling. He saved almost everything he earned. By his early 20s, he was doing well enough by any reasonable standard. He had a steady job, a small income, and the kind of cautious stability that many people in his position would have been grateful to hold on to. But George Eastman was not built for cautious stability. In 1877, at the age of 23, he started planning a trip to Santo Domingo. A colleague mentioned that bringing a camera would be a good idea, and so he bought one, along with all the equipment required to use it. This was not a simple purchase. Photography at the time was a serious, cumbersome undertaking. The camera itself was large and heavy. The glass plates used to capture images had to be coated with a wet chemical emulsion right before the exposure, then developed immediately afterward, before the coating dried. You needed a portable darkroom. You needed trays, chemicals, a tent. The full kit weighed roughly 50 pounds. He never actually made the trip to Santo Domingo, but the camera changed everything. He became fascinated, not just with taking pictures, but with the process itself, with the chemistry, the mechanics, the logistics of it all. He started experimenting in his mother's kitchen at night, trying to figure out whether there was a better way to do this. He had read about dry plates, glass plates pre-coated with a gelatin emulsion that didn't need to be prepared on the spot, which were being developed in England. He ordered formulas from British journals and spent months testing and adjusting, mixing batches of emulsion in the kitchen while holding down his day job at the bank. By 1880, he had developed a dry plate formula that actually worked, and he had invented a machine to coat the plates consistently. He patented both. He rented the third floor of a building in Rochester and began manufacturing dry plates commercially. He was 26 years old. He didn't quit the bank right away, that cautious, careful instinct again. But within a couple of years, the plate business was growing fast enough that he had to make a choice. He chose the plates. And that was the beginning of everything. The idea that changed everything. The dry plate was a genuine improvement. Photographers no longer needed to lug a portable darkroom into the field. But the glass plates were still heavy, still fragile, still expensive. And photography was still, fundamentally, a professional's game. Ordinary people didn't take pictures. They couldn't. The equipment was too complicated, too bulky, too costly. George Eastman looked at that situation and saw something different from what everyone else saw. He didn't see a niche market for professionals. He saw a vast, untapped world of ordinary people, families, travelers, adventurers, parents, who might want to capture their own lives if only someone made it possible. He started working on a new idea. Instead of glass plates, what if you used a flexible, lightweight material coated with the same photosensitive emulsion? Something that could be rolled up, loaded into a compact camera, and used by someone with no technical training whatsoever? It took years of experimentation and a series of intermediate steps, including a paper-based film that worked but produced grainy images, before he landed on something truly transformative. In 1889, working with chemist Henry Reichenbach, Eastman introduced a transparent, flexible film made from nitrocellulose. It was thin, light, and could be wound onto a spool. It was, in effect, modern photographic film. But the film alone wasn't enough. He needed a camera to put it in. In 1888, he had already introduced the first Kodak camera, a small, simple box loaded with enough film for 100 exposures. The user didn't focus, didn't adjust settings, didn't do much of anything except point the camera and press the button. When the roll was finished, you mailed the entire camera to the Kodak factory in Rochester. Kodak developed the film, printed the photographs, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and mailed everything back to you. The price was $25. The slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." It sounds almost laughably simple now, but in 1888, it was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time in history, a person with no knowledge of chemistry, no darkroom, and no technical skill could take a photograph. Just like that, photography stopped being a specialized craft and became something anyone could do. Orders came in faster than Eastman could process them. The name Kodak, which he invented himself, deliberately choosing a word that had no meaning in any language and could be pronounced the same way everywhere, spread across the country and then around the world. And he kept improving. The Brownie camera, introduced in 1900 and priced at just $1, was aimed specifically at children, at $1. He wanted photography to be so accessible that even a kid with pocket money could afford it. Within a year, over 100,000 brownies had been sold. By the early 20th century, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of the photographic film and paper market in the United States. The company had factories in Rochester, London, Paris, and Berlin. It employed tens of thousands of people. George Eastman was one of the wealthiest men in America, and he was not yet done building. But before we get to the extraordinary things he did with that wealth, and what eventually happened to him, there's something about the man himself that needs to be understood. Because George Eastman, for all his success, was a deeply private and in some ways deeply lonely person. And that loneliness ran right through the center of everything that followed. The man behind the company. George Eastman never married. He never had children. He lived, for much of his adult life, in a large mansion on East Avenue in Rochester, a house he designed himself, with formal gardens, a pipe organ installed in the entrance hall, and a staff to manage it all. He hosted elegant dinner parties and musical performances. He was considered charming company, witty, precise, occasionally funny. He had close friendships, particularly with a handful of men he had known for decades. But there was always a certain distance to him, a controlled quality. People who knew him well described a man who was warm in private, but guarded about his inner life, who was generous with money, but careful about what he revealed of himself. His relationship with his mother was the great emotional constant of his early life. After his father died, Maria Eastman had held the family together through genuine hardship, and George never forgot it. When he started making real money, one of his first priorities was making sure she never had to worry again. He moved her into good housing, provided for everything she needed, and spent as much time with her as his schedule allowed. There was something almost reverent about the way he spoke of her, not in public speeches, where he rarely said much personal at all, but in private letters and in the behavior of a man who clearly organized part of his emotional life around the fact of her survival and her comfort. She died in 1907, and people who knew Eastman said that something shifted in him after that. Not immediately, not visibly. He kept working, kept building, kept pushing Kodak forward. But the emotional anchor she had provided was gone. Some of his closest friends felt it. He became, if anything, more committed to his work and his philanthropy after her death, as if pouring himself into those things more fully was the only sensible response to a loss he wasn't going to talk about. The other significant relationship in his life was with Josephine Dickman, the wife of a close friend. Their relationship was, by all accounts, a deep and genuine friendship. She attended his dinner parties, travelled with his social circle, and was one of the few people with whom he seemed truly at ease. But it was never anything beyond friendship in any public sense, and after her husband's death, she remained one of Eastman's most trusted companions until his final years. He was not a man who leaned on other people easily. He was not a man who asked for help. And he was almost pathologically uncomfortable with being the subject of sentiment or ceremony. When his contributions were praised, he deflected. When monuments were proposed in his honor, he discouraged them. He seemed genuinely more interested in what his money could do than in being seen doing it. And what his money did was extraordinary. The fortune he gave away. By the early 20th century, George Eastman had accumulated a personal fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms. And rather than hold on to it or pass it to heirs, he had no children and seems to have had little interest in creating a dynasty. He began, methodically and with characteristic precision, to give it away. His giving was not random or sentimental. It was strategic, focused, and often anonymous. For years, he donated millions to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology under a pseudonym, Mr. Smith, because he didn't want the gifts to be connected to his name. When MIT finally discovered the truth and insisted on honoring him publicly, he relented only reluctantly. He gave because he believed the money would do good, not because he wanted recognition for it. His largest single commitment was to the University of Rochester. Over the course of his lifetime, he donated approximately $50 million to the institution, the equivalent of well over $1 billion today. Much of that funding went toward building the Eastman School of Music, which opened in 1921 and quickly became one of the most respected music conservatories in the world. He loved music deeply. The pipe organ in his mansion was not decorative, and he saw a world-class music school as something Rochester genuinely needed. He also funded the establishment of dental clinics for children in Rochester, London, Paris, Rome, Brussels, and Stockholm, a network of free clinics that provided dental care to kids who would otherwise never have received it. He had grown up without access to that kind of care, and he never forgot what it felt like to be a child without resources. His contributions to Hampton Institute and Tuskegee Institute, two historically black colleges in the American South, were substantial, and came at a time when philanthropic support for black education was neither fashionable nor expected from wealthy white industrialists. He gave because he believed education was the most effective tool for human advancement. Full stop. By the time he was done, he had given away the vast majority of his fortune. He once said, in a characteristically blunt way, that he had gotten to a point where he felt he had accumulated more than he needed, and that holding on to it past that point seemed to him simply wasteful. He was not performing generosity. He had calculated it, the same way he calculated everything. And yet, for all of that, something was quietly beginning to go wrong. Not with Kodak, not with his finances, but with George Eastman himself, in a way that no amount of money or philanthropy could fix. The body that began to fail. In the late 1920s, George Eastman began to experience problems with his spine. He was in his mid-70s, and the symptoms, stiffness, difficulty walking, a progressive loss of mobility, were unmistakable signs of a degenerative spinal condition. Doctors eventually identified it as a disorder affecting the lower spinal cord, a condition that causes the spinal tissue to harden and deteriorate over time, with no cure and no means of reversal. The progression was slow at first. He adapted, as he always had. He used a cane, adjusted his routines, continued hosting his dinner parties, and managing his affairs with as much energy as he could bring to bear. He had spent his entire life being in control of things, and he approached his own physical decline the same way he had approached business problems, systematically, without self-pity, looking for whatever margin of function remained. But the condition worsened. By the early 1930s, he was struggling to walk unassisted. A man who had hiked through African game reserves, he was an avid hunter and had undertaken several expeditions to East Africa, most notably a long journey through Kenya and Uganda in 1927, now found himself dependent on others for basic movement. He had once walked through wild terrain for weeks at a time, and now he needed help crossing a room. That was not a small thing for someone who had been self-sufficient in every meaningful sense since the age of 14. Visitors to the East Avenue mansion in those final years described a man who was still sharp and engaged mentally, still curious about the world, still present in conversation. The mind had not gone. But the body's failure was visibly frustrating to him in a way he could not entirely conceal. He made fewer appearances at public events. He shortened his gatherings. He moved through his own home with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who had learned to manage the distance between one chair and the next. He watched what was coming with clear eyes. He had seen enough illness in his mother's final years and in the lives of people around him to understand the trajectory he was on. The spinal tissue was not going to repair itself. The mobility was not coming back. What lay ahead was a future of increasing dependence, increasing pain, and a gradual narrowing of the world to whatever he could reach from a chair or a bed. For someone else, that future might have been acceptable. Managed with medication, surrounded by family, supported by faith or by resignation. But George Eastman had no children. His mother was long gone. His closest friend among women, Josephine Dickman, had her own life and her own limits. He had spent 77 years building, deciding, controlling, moving, and he could see, with the same analytical clarity that had made him a great businessman, exactly what the rest of his life was going to look like. He did not want it. The last morning. On March 14th, 1932, George Eastman gathered several close friends at his East Avenue mansion. It was described as a casual visit, the kind of afternoon gathering he had hosted hundreds of times over the decades. He was, by the accounts of those who were there, in good spirits, composed. Perhaps a little more deliberate in his warmth than usual, though people only understood that later. Before the gathering, he had updated his will. He had also, in the days prior, put his remaining affairs in careful order, the way a man does when he is finishing something rather than continuing it. After his guests left, he went to his bedroom. He wrote a short note, just 2 sentences, and left it on the nightstand. Then he passed away from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 77 years old. The note he left behind said something to the effect that his work was done, and that he saw no reason to cause anyone further trouble. That was it. 2 sentences. No elaboration, no philosophical statement, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet accounting. The work is finished, and I don't want to be a burden. The news spread through Rochester within hours and across the country by the following morning. For many people, it was genuinely incomprehensible. Here was one of the most successful men in American history. A man who had built an empire, given away a fortune, and left a visible mark on the world that would last for generations. What could possibly have been missing? But the people who knew him best were not entirely surprised. They knew about the spinal condition. They knew what his daily life had become. And they knew that George Eastman had always been, at his core, a man who controlled his circumstances. When control was no longer possible. When the body that had carried him through 77 years of relentless work was finally failing beyond repair. He made one last decision, quietly, alone, without drama. What he left behind at Kodak. While all of this was unfolding in Eastman's personal life, Kodak was entering a period of extraordinary dominance. Through the 1930s, 1940s, and into the post-war boom, the company was essentially synonymous with photography itself. The word Kodak had entered the language in a way that very few brand names ever do, not just as the name of a product, but as a verb, a shorthand for the act of capturing a moment. Kodak film was in the cameras of soldiers in World War II. Kodak color film, Kodachrome, introduced in 1935, became the gold standard for professional photographers and amateur enthusiasts alike. The rich, slightly warm tones of Kodachrome are so distinctive that even people who never consciously studied photography recognize them from family slides or magazine photographs of the mid-20th century. It was a genuinely beautiful product, and for decades it was irreplaceable. The company's business model was elegant: sell cameras cheaply, make the real money on film and processing. It was, in structural terms, very similar to what razors and blades companies do. The hardware was almost a loss leader, designed to lock customers into a consumable product they would need to keep buying forever. And it worked, spectacularly, for decades. Kodak employed over 60,000 people in Rochester alone at its peak. The city was, in a very real sense, a Kodak city. The company's influence touched nearly every institution in Rochester: the schools, the hospitals, the concert halls, the neighborhoods where its workers lived. George Eastman had wanted to build something that would support and elevate the community around it, and for a long time, that's exactly what Kodak did. But there was something happening inside the company's walls in the 1970s that almost nobody outside, and only a few people inside, understood the significance of. A Kodak engineer named Stephen Sasson built something in 1975. He was 24 years old, and he had been given a relatively open-ended assignment. See what you can do with a new kind of electronic sensor called a charge-coupled device. Sasson spent months experimenting, salvaging parts from other Kodak equipment, and eventually assembled a device about the size of a toaster. He pointed it at a lab assistant, pressed a button, and captured an image that was stored not on film, but as digital information on a cassette tape. It took about 23 seconds to record the image. The resolution was 0.01 megapixels. The image, when read back and displayed on a television screen, was grainy and imprecise. But it existed, a photograph without film. Sasson presented his invention to Kodak's management. He described, with remarkable accuracy for 1975, the path this technology was likely to take, how resolution would improve, how storage would become cheaper and faster, how digital photography could eventually challenge film-based photography in ways the company needed to take seriously. The response from management was something between skepticism and dismissal. The technology was noted, filed away, and effectively shelved. Kodak was making billions of dollars from film. Digital photography, in 1975, was a grainy image on a television screen. The business case for disrupting your own most profitable product, for cannibalizing something that was working spectacularly well, was, from a short-term perspective, essentially non-existent. And so the decision was made, quietly and without much drama, to let the thing sit. The slow unraveling. The world, of course, did not stand still. Through the 1980s and 1990s, digital imaging technology advanced along exactly the trajectory Stephen Sasson had described. Japanese companies, Sony, Canon, Nikon, invested heavily in digital cameras and began building market share. Consumer electronics companies that had never been in the photography business started competing for the same customers Kodak had owned for a century. Kodak was not entirely absent from this development. The company did invest in digital technology. It introduced a line of digital cameras in the 1990s and developed early digital imaging software. It even helped build some of the infrastructure that digital photography would eventually run on. But the investments were incremental, and the commitment was half-hearted, because making them fully would have meant acknowledging something the company couldn't quite bring itself to acknowledge, that the product at the center of its entire business model was eventually going to become obsolete. Film sales peaked in the late 1990s. The number that is often cited is the year 2000, when Kodak sold roughly 800 million rolls of film globally. And then the decline began. Not gradually at first, but with the sudden acceleration that happens when a technology shift reaches the mainstream. Digital cameras became affordable for ordinary consumers around 2000 and 2001. Camera phones arrived shortly after. And with camera phones came the final fatal shift. Photography was no longer a deliberate activity that required planning, equipment, or the knowledge that each exposure cost money. It was instantaneous and free. In 2004, Kodak announced it would stop making film cameras for the US and European markets. In 2009, Kodachrome, the film that had been the emotional heart of American photography for over 7 decades, was discontinued. The last roll of Kodachrome was processed in December 2010 at a single remaining lab in Parsons, Kansas, that had kept the specialized chemistry alive just long enough to process the final few rolls. In January 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that George Eastman had built from scratch in his mother's kitchen had roughly $6 billion in debt and had not turned a meaningful profit in years. The fall was not sudden in the way that collapses sometimes are. It was long, and it was visible, and it was, for the people of Rochester, and for anyone who had watched the company's history, genuinely painful to witness. 60,000 jobs had once anchored that city to a secure economic future. By the time the bankruptcy filing came through, that workforce had contracted to under 7,000. George Eastman had been dead for 80 years by then. But the company he built, the name he invented, the vision he had committed his entire life to, all of it had come apart in roughly the span of a decade. Rochester and the weight of it all. To understand what Kodak's collapse meant, you have to understand what Kodak was in Rochester. It wasn't just an employer, it was the ecosystem. For generations, a significant portion of Rochester's working population either worked for Kodak directly or worked for businesses that existed to serve Kodak and its employees. The company paid wages that were, by manufacturing standards, genuinely good. It offered health benefits and pensions and profit-sharing arrangements that were considered model programs. George Eastman had believed, deeply and practically, that employees who were treated well and paid fairly would work harder and more loyally, and he structured Kodak's labor practices accordingly. For most of the 20th century, those practices held. When the contraction began in earnest in the 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s, the effect on Rochester was devastating in the slow, grinding way that deindustrialization always is. Not a single catastrophic event, but thousands of individual ones. A layoff notice, a closed facility, a neighborhood where property values dropped because the anchor employer was no longer anchoring anything. Schools lost funding. Businesses that had served Kodak workers for decades closed. Young people who might have stayed in Rochester and built careers there left instead, because the jobs weren't there anymore. The city's population declined sharply from its mid-century peak, and that decline did not reverse. Rochester is still there. It is a city that has worked, with considerable effort and some success, to reinvent itself around other industries and institutions. The University of Rochester, its medical center, a growing technology sector. But the shadow of what Kodak was and what happened to it lies over the city in a way that anyone who spends time there can feel. There are still Eastman's fingerprints all over Rochester. The Eastman School of Music still produces world-class musicians. The dental clinics he funded are long gone, but the spirit of the public health infrastructure he helped build persists. His mansion on East Avenue is now a museum, the George Eastman Museum, which is also the world's oldest photography museum. You can walk through the rooms where he lived, see the garden where that 1930 photograph was taken, stand in the entrance hall where the pipe organ once played. It is, in many ways, a beautiful memorial to a remarkable life. And yet it also sits in a city that still carries the wounds of what came after, the legacy that doesn't fit neatly. George Eastman's story doesn't resolve cleanly. It doesn't have the arc that we tend to prefer in stories about great men, the triumphant finale, the sunset scene, the evidence that it all added up to something permanently good. What it has instead is something more complicated and more honest. He was a man who started with nothing and built something that genuinely changed the way human beings live. Not in a metaphorical way, but in the specific, practical sense that photography altered how families remember themselves, how history is documented, how the world is seen. Before Kodak, the past was mostly words and paintings. After Kodak, it was images. That shift was enormous, and George Eastman made it happen. He gave away most of what he earned, strategically and generously, and the institutions he funded are still doing the work he intended them to do. The Eastman School of Music has produced hundreds of musicians who have performed on stages around the world. The University of Rochester's Medical Center has treated hundreds of thousands of patients. Those are not small things. And yet, he was also a man who died alone in his bedroom by his own choice at 77, not because his life was empty, but because his body was failing and he could not accept the loss of control that lay ahead. He had given everything to his work and to his philanthropy, and perhaps not enough to the kind of human connection that might have made the final chapter feel worth enduring. He was also the founder of a company that eventually became, in the eyes of many business scholars, a cautionary story about what happens when a dominant organization cannot reimagine itself. The digital camera was invented inside Kodak's own walls. The technology that would eventually destroy the film business was discovered by a Kodak engineer on a Kodak assignment using Kodak resources, and the company chose not to fully pursue it because it was too disruptive to the thing that was already working. That is not a simple failure. It is a deeply human one. It is the kind of decision that organizations and people make all the time when protecting what you have feels safer than risking it for something uncertain. And it is the kind of decision that, in retrospect, looks obvious in a way it almost never does in the moment. George Eastman himself was not alive for any of this. He could not have foreseen digital photography in 1932, and it would be unfair to hold him responsible for choices made decades after his death. But the culture he built, conservative, precise, protective of what worked, may have been part of what made those later choices possible. The man and the company were made of the same material, and both, in the end, found the same limit. What remains? There is still a Kodak. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 as a much smaller entity focused on commercial printing and imaging technology for businesses rather than consumers. It employs a fraction of the people it once did, operates out of a fraction of the space, and occupies a fraction of the public consciousness it once commanded. But it exists, which is more than many people expected after the 2012 filing, and more than some felt it deserved. The name still carries weight in a particular way. For people of a certain age, Kodak doesn't just mean a camera company. It means something closer to memory itself. The smell of a dark room, the warm colours of a slide projected onto a sheet hung on a living room wall, the particular look of photographs taken before digital processing made images crisp and cool and instantly adjustable. There is a phrase that showed up in the popular vocabulary around 2012, not long after the bankruptcy filing. Kodak moment, a phrase that had once meant a perfect, worth-capturing instant, started to acquire a second meaning in business circles. A moment when a company fails to see the disruption that is already happening around it and pays the price. Business schools began teaching the Kodak story as a case study in strategic blindness, in the danger of defending a profitable present at the cost of an uncertain but necessary future. The irony is sharp. A company so identified with capturing the moment ultimately missed the most important moment of its own history. George Eastman, for his part, left behind exactly what he intended to: institutions, opportunities, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who spent his money where he believed it would do the most good. His personal effects were modest. His will left the bulk of his remaining estate to the University of Rochester. He requested no elaborate funeral and received a simple one. He had said, in one of the relatively few personal reflections he left on record, that he believed a person's life should be judged by what they built for others, not by what they accumulated for themselves. By that measure, the accounting is genuinely favourable. The schools stand, the music plays, the photographs, billions of them, taken by ordinary people who would never have picked up a camera if George Eastman hadn't decided to make it simple and cheap and possible. Those photographs still exist in albums and shoeboxes and attics all over the world. Images of children at birthday parties, of couples on their wedding days, of family vacations and Sunday afternoons and ordinary Tuesday mornings that someone once thought were worth remembering. He made that possible. all of it. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March 1932, in a quiet bedroom in Rochester, New York, he closed the chapter himself, in the same deliberate, unambiguous way he had closed every other chapter of his life. 2 sentences. No drama. Work done. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.